Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. In the previous episode, reference was made to two important aspects of life in the Holy Roman Empire around the year 1700. The first was the ongoing conflict with France under Louis XIV, which resulted in many wars. The second was the curious practice of the Habsburgs of intermarrying within their own bloodlines, giving rise to a high rate of inbreeding. One notable result of this inbreeding over the course of centuries was the so-called Habsburg jaw, which goes back at least as far as Charles V, but probably longer. The Habsburg rulers had a tendency toward what doctors call prognathism, that is, to quote Wikipedia, a positional relationship of the mandible or maxilla to the skeletal base, where either of the jaws protrudes beyond a predetermined imaginary line in the coronal plane of the skull, end quote. In layman's terms, these lines describe a lower jaw that juts out far past the upper jaw. This condition was common enough among the Habsburgs that it was literally named after them, and the emperor about whom we were last talking, Leopold I, was among the Habsburgs sporting this jaw in 1661. Leopold's nephew, named Charles, had acceded to the throne of Spain as Charles II. He too had the Habsburg jaw. However, this was the least of his deformities. If you've never seen a picture of Charles II, it behooves you to pause this podcast, bring up Google Images on your computer or mobile device, and have a look. I'll wait here. There, now you know what we're dealing with. Not only was Charles difficult to look at, but he also had congenital heart disease and a substantial learning disability. And although remarkably Charles was married twice, first to a daughter of the Duke of Orleans and second to the daughter of the Elector of the Palatinate, it's fairly clear that neither marriage was ever consummated, nor was there any expectation that the king could father a healthy child. As a result, since Charles was the last of the male Habsburg line in Spain, the question of who would succeed him arose almost from the moment he took the throne. Several solutions to this problem were suggested. One involved dividing Spain between the Austrian Habsburgs and France, providing each with some of the country. However, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold, the chief Austrian Habsburg, sought to preserve Spain for his family and suggested that his second oldest son, also named Charles, succeed Charles II as the next king of Spain. For his own part, Louis XIV, who was still king of France, suggested his own grandson, who was named Philip. This suggestion was a non-starter for the Habsburgs. Not only would one of Louis's grandchildren becoming king of Spain deny the throne to a Habsburg, but it would also unite the crowns of France and Spain when Philip one day became king of France. After all, he was only second in line to the French throne. Finally, within Spain itself, factions lined up supporting either Charles or Philip to be the king. The matter came to a head in the fall of 1700 when Charles II died at the ripe old age of 38. Louis wasted no time promoting his grandson, and Philip was proclaimed the King of Spain from Versailles just 2 weeks later. Louis still had the enemies he had made in the previous century, and they united to renew the grand alliance that they had formed against him earlier. In the summer of 1701, war broke out again. On one side was Leopold's empire, fighting alongside Britain, the Netherlands, and Prussia. On the other side was France, which was supported by several German-speaking states, including Bavaria and Cologne. The war was a long and hard one. 4 years into it, Leopold died and was succeeded by his son, Joseph I, who continued to fight to put his brother Charles on the throne. Joseph's short reign ended in 1711 when he died of smallpox. As a result, his brother Charles became emperor as Charles VI and continued fighting for the throne of Spain. When, in 1715, peace was concluded and the war ended, both France and the Habsburg monarchy benefited. On the one hand, Louis's Bourbon dynasty had its claim to the throne of Spain validated, although part of the settlement required that the monarchs of Spain renounce any future claims to the French throne. On the other hand, although the Habsburgs lost the throne of Spain, they gained significant influence in Italy and reasserted direct rule in the Spanish Netherlands, which Spain had retained after the secession of the Dutch Protestants in the previous century. However, Emperor Charles had his own succession problem, although Charles's wife, Elizabeth Christina of Brunswick, had borne him a son named Leopold. That son had died just 6 months later. Furthermore, the couple's 3 surviving children were all daughters, the eldest of whom was named Maria Theresa. The problem was that the Habsburg monarchy was ruled by the Salic law, which stipulated that neither women nor the descendants of women could rule. However, Charles had anticipated the problem of a lack of a male successor. 3 years before his son was born and died shortly thereafter, Charles had issued the so-called Pragmatic Sanction. According to this document, Charles's eldest child, if a daughter, would, upon his death, inherit all of the Habsburg family's lands, including not only Austria and Bohemia, but also Croatia, the Austrian Netherlands, and several Habsburg territories in Italy. It was not difficult for Charles to issue the Pragmatic Sanction in and of itself. The problem was that his late brother also had 2 daughters who were both technically higher up in the line of succession than Maria Theresa was. Charles therefore sought the consent of the other powers in Europe to the Pragmatic Sanction. Charles's hope was that if the other countries agreed to the sanction, Maria Theresa's cousins would not wage war against her. It took him a while, but Charles ultimately won the consent of most of the powers in Europe. Different countries asked for different things from Charles in return, whether territory or recognition of some claim or desire of their own. The greatest demand to which Charles conceded was to close the Austin Company. If the Austin Company doesn't sound familiar, that's because we haven't discussed it before. Almost everyone knows that the Atlantic powers in Europe, namely Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, launched colonial projects both in the Americas and in Asia. During the so-called Age of Exploration, these projects had won enormous wealth for the countries in question. As we mentioned a few moments ago, the Habsburgs re-established control over the part of the Netherlands that had remained loyal to Spain in its war with the Dutch. Therefore, the Habsburg monarchy now had an Atlantic port at Austin, a city that is today in Belgium. In 1722, as he was pursuing continent-wide approval for the Pragmatic Sanction, Emperor Charles granted an imperial charter for colonial trade between Austin and ports in contemporary India and China. Not surprisingly, he began to cut into the business already being conducted in that part of the world by the British and the French, who subsequently began pressuring Charles to rein in his activities. Ultimately, they withheld their approval of the Pragmatic Sanction until Charles relented, which he did in 1731. Less than a decade into its charter, the Austin Company was dissolved. Although another abortive attempt was launched later in the 18th century, Austrian overseas imperialism pretty much ended here. In 1722, as he was pursuing continent-wide approval for the Pragmatic Sanction, Emperor Charles granted an imperial charter for colonial trade between Austin and ports in contemporary India and China. Not surprisingly, he began to cut into the business already being conducted in that part of the world by the British and the French, who subsequently began pressuring Charles to rein in his activities. Ultimately, they withheld their approval of the Pragmatic Sanction until Charles relented, which he did in 1731. Less than a decade into its charter, the Austin Company was dissolved. Although another abortive attempt was launched later in the 18th century, Austrian overseas imperialism pretty much ended here. The remainder of Charles's reign as Emperor and Archduke of Austria was consumed by more war and his last engagement with the Ottomans. As a result of fighting the Turks, Charles lost most of his family's lands in the Balkans, at least for the time being. When he died from eating poison mushrooms a year after that war ended, Charles had left the empire in poor shape. The imperial treasury was down to a mere 100,000 florins, worth today only about $5.2 million. Compare this amount to the U.S. federal budgets of today, which are in the trillions of dollars, literally millions of dollars, and you'll get a sense of how poor Charles had left his realm. Maria Theresa ascended the throne of the Habsburg domains upon her father's death, but she did not take the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, which forbade any woman from ruling over it. Instead, that title went to Charles, the Prince-Elector of Bavaria, who became Emperor Charles VII. He was a member of the Wittelsbach dynasty and thus the first member of a family other than the Habsburg family to occupy the imperial throne for 300 years, although his wife, Archduchess Maria Amalia of Austria, was in fact a Habsburg. Charles VII reigned for only 3 years until his death in 1745. He was succeeded by Duke Francis of Tuscany. Francis was Maria Theresa's husband and a member of the House of Lorraine. Their union gave rise to the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. This new house would rule the Holy Roman Empire until its dissolution in 1804 and would rule Austria until 1918. Because of her father's legacy as leader of the Habsburg monarchy, Maria Theresa was going to have her work cut out for her, and that work didn't count the war that she was going to have to fight to confirm her father's pragmatic sanction. You see, there were those cousins of Maria Theresa's whom we mentioned a few moments ago. They were the ones who were higher in the line of succession than she was. By 1745, they had married into the royal houses of Saxony and Bavaria. When Maria Theresa took the Austrian throne, these two states, backed by Prussia, declared war. The great powers backed their regular allies, France siding with Prussia, Bavaria, and Saxony, and the Netherlands and Britain backing Maria Theresa. This new war, called the War of the Austrian Succession, was another long and costly conflict that engulfed many of the powers in Europe. Nearly 8 years of war allowed several powers to try to chip away at Habsburg supremacy in Central Europe. In the end, the treaty signed at Aachen in 1748 confirmed Maria Theresa as the Habsburg ruler. The cost was Silesia, which the Habsburgs ceded to Prussia, parts of Bavaria, which were ceded back to that country's royal family, and several of the family's Italian holdings. Maria Theresa retained the Austrian Netherlands. Very importantly, the rivalry that will involve Austria and Prussia until 1871 began with the War of the Austrian Succession. Silesia would continue to be an issue between the two countries, as well as other matters that we will address in later episodes. The biggest change caused by the war was the shuffling of diplomatic alliances on the continent. The short version is that Austria and the UK broke their alliance, and Austria turned to an alliance with France. In turn, Prussia formed an alliance with the UK, breaking with France, which it had supported in Austria's succession war. Britain's gamble was that Prussia would be a more effective deterrent against France than the Habsburgs had been. In 1756, the Habsburg monarchy signed the First Treaty of Versailles with France, with each side promising to aid the other if conflict emerged with a third party. In response, Prussia's King Frederick the Great invaded Saxony and started the 7 Years' War, which was fought between 1756 and 1763. The 7 Years' War has been called the First Global War. It is remembered primarily as a war fought partly in the colonies of the great powers. Since neither Austria nor Prussia had overseas colonies, the result in Europe was largely status quo. During all this time, Maria Theresa occupied the Habsburg throne. At the same time, her husband ruled the empire, at least until 2 years after the 7 Years' War ended. In that year, Maria Theresa's son, who was named Joseph, would accede to the imperial throne as Joseph II and become co-ruler of the Habsburg monarchy with his mother. Next time, we'll talk about the transformation of the Habsburg monarchy under Maria Theresa and Joseph II. Thanks for listening.